All right. So today I'm giving a talk on string figures. As explained by the title, it's a global and cross-cultural analysis of string figures. So I think it's a good idea to start from the basics. So what is a string figure? It's quite a specific definition. So there's lots of string games and not games in cultures worldwide, but the one that people play all over is a string figure type of game. So basically, by definition, a string figure always starts with an open loop of string. You can have a short loop like this one, or a very long loop like this one, which is taller than myself. And what you'll do is basically, quite commonly, you start with this. It's called position 1. And then you start applying these moves. This one is called opening A. And then you'll just start kind of weaving your way through, applying this mental kind of algorithm that you've learned by heart. And then you'll end up with something like this, which is a Melanesian string figure from Fiji and Eastern Papua. And in this case, actually, what they've discovered is a kind of algorithm that you can keep on applying. So you can kind of repeat what you did right there. And unless I make a mistake, we should get an increasingly complex version of that same string figure. But if you're a reasonable person, you might ask, why should we care? So what I just showed you is just one out of about 3,000 known traditional or indigenous string figures. And indeed, it is a widespread game. It might just be the most widespread game or form of play or entertainment across traditional and indigenous cultures worldwide. But second, I'll also explain in this talk that it is a perfectly formalizable cultural trait. So basically, you can define string figures mathematically because they're mathematical knots, which means that they're quite a nice kind of vehicle to study cultural transmission because you have this widespread form of culture that's perfectly mathematically describable. And then fourth, I'll end this talk by discussing some of the implications that we think that string figures have on the emergence of mathematical thinking in the deep human past. So this talk is based on a preprint that is now published on OSF. So if you're interested, please have a look. The dataset is also public over there. And it's co-authored by myself and Matthew Walsh, Alison Hendrick, Izzy Wisher, Elena Mio, Mikael Mannen, and Jussi Eronen, and Felix Riede. So you might not know this, but string figures are actually a very old topic of study in anthropology. So basically what happened was that when people, anthropologists and other kind of scientific explorers started traveling across the world, they noticed that cultures worldwide are playing the kind of same games as they used to play as kids. So for instance, by the way, this is our sample here. It's a game that's played all over the world. I'll show that later as well. But basically what happened was that people like Alfred Russel Wallace here, who describes his encounter with kids in Borneo. So Wallace was trying to impress these kids by showing them the English or American cat's cradle game, which is a very simple set of string figures. But then it turned out that these kids actually were much better and more advanced in making different kinds of variations of this, which totally blew Wallace's mind at that point, which he writes about quite eloquently here. But the same thing basically happened all over among early anthropologists. So many of these quite famous and notable figures that you might know, like Franz Boas, Diamond Gennis, Yulia Verkieva, and in Russia, also Bogoras and Knut Rasmussen in the Arctic and so on. And especially Alfred Haddon developed an interest in studying string figures because not only they kind of noticed that, hey, there might be something here regarding cultural diffusion or cultural transmission, but also they discovered that it's a very nice way to establish rapport between the people they were observing. So it's a nice way to establish contact. Even to the extent that Alfred Haddon said that every anthropologist should learn to make string figures, which is, I think, quite interesting because today this is much, much forgotten. But the most prominent student of early string figure science, if you may, was the lady pictured here, Caroline Furness-Jane, who in 1906 wrote this book, String Figures and How to Make Them, where she documented, I think, a couple of hundred string figures with like 1,000 illustrations of string figures worldwide. And like you see from this review in Nature here, the interest was very much in studying cultural diffusion through how people make string figures differently in societies worldwide. And just as an example here, what the documentations look like, this is from Knut Rasmussen's reports from the 5th Thule expedition in what's now northern Canada, where he documented, in this case, copper Inuit string figures. So these are very meticulous documentations of string figures from societies worldwide with amazing depictions and diagrams and great care put into documenting these accurately. By the way, this book is almost 100 years old. I scanned it and no one had ever opened it before myself. So it's something truly that people have forgotten, I think. However, as you know, academic trends come and go. And I think mostly because this kind of more postmodern anthropology took a foothold in academia, I think people kind of gave up on the idea of studying cultural diffusion altogether. And also these early anthropologists really didn't have any methods or computational tools to do comparative analysis. So they were obviously not noticing all these similarities between societies. But there soon kind of emerged this pessimism in the 60s onwards, even to this day, that, you know, we couldn't really say anything about cultural contact or cultural transmission through studying string figures, which I hope to kind of provide a few counter arguments in this talk against. Anyways, whilst the academic crowd were having their debates, there emerged a kind of citizen science of string figures. So the International String Figure Association was founded in the 70s. I'm now a member of that fine association myself. So you had lots of enthusiastic people who were just often just interested in string figures, but also noticing these patterns of cultural transmission and diffusion and developing mathematical ways of studying them. And ISFA, the association, actually have their own journal, the Bulletin, which is frankly just amazing to me. It's like one of the most amazing aspects of citizen science that I've seen, but they've run like analysis of hundreds of otherwise forgotten ethnographic documents and recorded this rapidly disappearing form of cultural heritage. So from that combination of this early ethnographic anthropological work and the documents of the International String Figure Association, we managed to gather a sample of 826 string figures across 92 societies, but that's only, like I said, a fraction. I think there might be a total of like 3,000 string figures documented worldwide, just that it takes a lot of time currently to analyze them, so we had to kind of cap that at some point. So this is our sample. As you can see, it's really covers most of the globe, basically most of the world except for Central Asia, where we couldn't find any data. Of course, it doesn't mean that there isn't any data or there aren't string figures being made there. It's just very often in ethnographic studies, you have this blank spot in this region. But truly, it's something that people have done worldwide, and most of our data comes from the early 1900s. So I think most of it, at least, can't be explained by recent contact. But yeah, to the point. So that's the background of this, why I think it's interesting scientifically, but we ended up developing a couple of methods here on how to actually formalize and study string figures. So I'll just explain those very briefly by giving you a short introduction to a specific form of knot theory methods. So knot theory is a field of mathematics that studies mathematical knots. And mathematical knots are a bit unlike your everyday knots, as you can see from the mathematical knots. These are actually the prime knots in knot theory. They always have closed ends. They, like, unlike your shoelace knot, they don't have any loose ends. They're always tied together. And fortunately, it is the case that a string figure is always made from an open loop, which is the simplest knot, which is the unknot. But the undot, confusingly, still is a knot mathematically, so we can use knot theory methods to study them. So I'll just show briefly how this happens. And to do that, we have to go a bit back in history to the pretty much the origins of knot theory mathematics. You have this guy, obviously one of the most influential mathematicians of all time, I'm sure. So Gauss developed a method called Gauss code. Well, he didn't call that Gauss code, but we call that Gauss code today. As you can see from Gauss's signature here, he had this affinity towards knots. Even his signature had these little twirly knot-like structures. So he was clearly enamored by knots somehow. Gauss code is actually very simple, I think. It's pretty much the simplest method available in knot theory. So what you do is you select a mathematical knot of choice. This is the trefoil knot. That's the simplest non-trivial knot. So it's the simplest knot that isn't the unknot, which is the open loop. By the way, this is something that you'll commonly see across culturally significant objects. Like in this case, you have Thor's hammer, the Mjolnir, with this trefoil knot inscribed onto it. So it's something you see really, if you just walk in museums, I'm sure, ethnographic museums, I'm sure you'll see lots of trefoil knots. Anyways, what you do is you pick a point. It's called the base point. And then this arrow signifies the orientation. And then you just imagine yourself being a tiny little ant on this knot, and starting from the base point towards the orientation, you start labeling all the places where the string crosses itself in order by following the knot. So you have the first crossing there, and the second, and the third. It's the trefoil knot. It has just 3 crossings. And then you return to your base point, and then again, imagine being this ant, and then whenever you're going under the crossing, when you're in an underpass, you record that as a negative. And when you're crossing the other string from above, overpass, then it's a positive. So here we'd start like -1 + 2 -3 + 1 -2 + 3. And that's indeed the Gauss code for the trefoil knot. So I think it's to this point, it's quite nice and elegant, but it'll get a bit more confusing, especially when we start getting more and more complex string figures. So here you have one of the most common string figures in our data set that I'll talk more about later. And you can do basically the exact same thing and come up with a Gauss code for this one. And people have, including string figure enthusiasts, but also knot theorists, have developed methods where you can actually verify a Gauss code. So you can plug in this Gauss code that I just did, and it'll say that, yeah, that's an unknot. It unravels to an open loop, which is actually very useful. In this case, this is Martin Probert's string figure analyzer, or something he did for the International String Figure Association, which was originally intended to help people design string figures from scratch, but we used it for very different purposes, for cross-cultural research here. But yeah, string figures get a lot more involved than that. So this is, for instance, a Gauss code for this copper Inuit string figure. And you can get the kind of, I had to do this, by the way, manually. So this labeling took a fair bit of effort. I hope that later this might be automated. And yeah, I should say that this one I also checked, it's actually correctly illustrated. So that's, again, emphasizes the amount of effort that ethnographers put into documenting these. So this is from, again, Grundlagsmuseum's documentations of copper Inuit string figures from a century ago. But this illustration probably contains no mistakes. But there's a problem, and there always is, which is when I said that you pick a base point and an orientation, it's actually arbitrary which point and which direction you choose. And for instance, for this Jacob's ladder string figure, you have a total of 216 possible Gauss codes, depending on where you start and which direction you go towards. And that's something I definitely didn't want to do by hand, manually. And it's also a bit of a problem because you might have this string figure, for instance, but in different documents, ethnographers might, record it the other way around in very kind of different forms. These are all the same string figure here illustrated, but they look very different. So you can't really rely on your own judgment and matching two identical string figures. So what I did was I wrote a program. I called it the Gauss coder. Basically, just give it as input one correctly written Gauss code, and it'll spit out all possible combinations of Gauss codes, which results in a single string figure being represented by this long sequence of Gauss codes, illustrated here behind the string figure. In this case, the string figure is then formally defined by this sequence of almost 12,000 numbers. But that's basically like the DNA of a string figure, if you made it. It entirely describes the structure, the topology of the string figure. And then we did basically just pattern matching. If you're interested in the methods, we used Q-grams and then created Q-gram profiles and then took the cosine distance between those. But if you're not interested in the technical bits, then basically what in the most kind of elementary way of describing it, we're just doing a pattern matching. So here, for instance, on the left, you have two very similar string figures. So you can clearly see that they have these similar patterns between them. And those are all encoded in the Gauss code sequence. So basically, you're just pattern matching, finding similar structures. And if two string figures have all the same substructures, they're basically the same string figure. And so they have a distance of 0. And if they have no traits in common, then they have a distance of 1. So you kind of formalize conveniently the similarity of two string figures to, well, between 0 and 1. So recently we've actually been developing further methods to study any kind of string object using this methodology, even knots that aren't mathematical knots. So basically you could Gauss code your t-shirt if you wanted. And this picture here, you have fragments of what used to be a fishing net. That's the oldest documented fishing net, Antrea net. It's in what used to be Eastern Finland, now on the Russian side, documented by Sakari Pels here. But basically, we're running another study on matching knots and other string objects from archaeological finds and extending this methodology. So once we have all the string figures in our data set represented in nice numerical form, where you can actually just plug them into a hierarchical clustering algorithm and it'll spit out this nice dendrogram we have here, where in the outermost clusters that are labeled there, I can appreciate that you can't really see the detail, but if you want, you can have a look at our PDF on OSF. But on the outermost clades are sets of mutually identical string figures. So in total, we had 826 string figures. Of those, we found 83 string figure structures that occur cross-culturally. And of those, about 50 had a geographical distribution that was somehow indicative, at least in our opinion, of their cultural transmission. And I'll show later a couple of those interesting ones, but just one little technical note before that. So actually, since we have these represented in numerical form, you can also study their complexity. So if you imagine two string figures like those on the right there, they both have a total of 16 crossings, but you'll notice the one on top is asymmetrical. It's actually perfectly asymmetrical, whereas the other has those symmetrical. Yeah, I was saying that we want to measure the complexity of string figures, and so we can basically just punish symmetry, and you can assign string figures a number of complexity, and based on the symmetry they'll get a lower score on complexity. We actually do that by just compressing them with the deflate algorithm, which is basically just zipping the files with the string figure Gauss codes, because data compression basically makes use of this symmetry in data, or repetitiveness, redundancy, right? Anyways, just that'll be useful later on. So I think equipped with these methods, I think we're now kind of ready to have another shot at this debate that anthropologists had a century ago, like, can you actually use string figures to study patterns of cultural transmission? And to me, that answer to that is a resounding yes. So just in the aggregate form, if we compare all possible pairs of string figures, if you look at the structurally identical ones, you'll notice here in the blue histogram, you'll notice they kind of have this more skewed distribution where the peak is around 0 to 5,000 kilometers, so proximate cultures, right? Whereas with all other string figures, it's a more normal-ish distribution. However, here I think the devil is really in the details, so you have to look deeper into the data, those little interesting clusters that I talked about before. So we'll have a look now, a deep dive into 5 of them. So here's one. This is, I call it Naubwebwe. It's after its Kiribati name. You make it like so with a mouth loop. And I'll present it here, and it's finished with, it's called the Caroline extension. And this thing, the Caroline extension, is something that you see throughout the Pacific in Oceania. You basically use your hands as the frame of the string figure, which allows, it's kind of an extension of string figure design. So it allows you to make all kinds of forms that aren't otherwise possible. And this is an interesting one because it's very, I'd say, like quite a simple string figure, yet it still appears only in a set of Pacific societies in Oceania, in Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, and even Australia. And interestingly, also, the name Naubwebwe refers to an origin story. So in Kiribati folklore, Naubwebwe is this kind of demigod who made string figures at the beginning of time. And indeed, in the ethnographies, it said that this string figure sequence starting with Naubwebwe is actually requisite knowledge to enter the afterlife. So you also notice that a lot of string figures have these kind of origin story-like tales associated to them, and religious and other cultural significance. But even though it's this relatively simple form of just 4 diamonds and appears almost exclusively in the Pacific, it's still made with a variety of methods. So to me, it seems like, I just showed the mouth loop opening, but you can also use a double wrist loop opening to make it and end up with this same structure. So it seems like people have deliberately even been experimenting with different ways of making the same string figure. And I'll explain why this is the reason a bit later on. But for a more complex example, you have what I call takapau. That's after its Maori name. This too is made with an opening A and finished with that same Caroline extension that I showed before. It's a bit more involved than the other one, but I'll just make that quite quickly here. And oh, okay. Sorry, I'll just scratch that. Anyways, it's also associated with a variety of origin stories. So in the name takapau, actually, takapau refers to a mat, but it's not just any mat. It's takapau nuku, apparently, which is a birthing mat, which refers to this story, origin story, basically, where you start the sequence of takapau nuku to tell a story of how mankind or humankind was born there. There we go. But again, even though it's a fairly complex one, people have been experimenting with different methods of making it. So in our data set, it's made actually with 4 different methods. And similar cases in Northern America, for instance, there's many stars that you see across the Western US, what's US today. Or to me, at least quite interestingly, this hare or caribou string figure that appears across the American Arctic, well, basically from Chukotka to Greenland, so all across from Siberia to Greenland. And what makes this one interesting is that it has these traits typical to a Arctic string figure, which is that you can actually set them in motion. And these are commonly used to tell stories. So here you have the caribou, and it runs and runs and runs until it, I think, encounters a hill, and then it conveniently disappears. And this kind of asymmetrical animal figure is something that is very typical to an Arctic string figure. And here is a swan that I've made, which is one of the more complex string figures I know of. And here, if I in that picture, let go of my right little finger, then it'll appear like the swan takes flight, which is quite amazing. Then it resolves into an open loop leaving behind and what's in the story associated with an empty lake. Or this one, it's the whale and the fox. I think this is the most complex string figure to make that I can make myself. It's just amazing how you create two separate animal forms there, the whale on the left and then the fox on the right. But this too is associated with a variety of stories across the Arctic. But basically, if you look at those on a map, you'll notice that they cluster. Like I said before, proximate cultures have similar string figures. So the ones I just showed here, you see Naubwebe in the pink circles and Takapau in the blue triangles and so on. But also you have what are truly global string figures. And those are the ones that really kind of threw me off, at least. What's happening here? You have the same string figure appearing in societies worldwide. And here in the black square, you have what's today in English known most commonly as Jacob's ladder. And this one is actually the most common string figure in our data set. So you can see all the societies represented there in this clade from that dendrogram I showed before. But what's strange is that this is the most common string figure in our data set, but it's not an especially simple one. So you kind of, you make it simple enough to a point, but then it's finished with this move that most beginners find quite difficult. So you're kind of in this point, and then what you have to do is do this inversion thing, which is quite unintuitive. And it's not like if I gave a random population of 100 people a loop of string and sent them to an island somewhere, I don't think any of them would really come up with this one. So it's really strange to see this appearing in traditional indigenous societies worldwide, and it's almost always made with the same method. There's basically only just one major variation in some regions in the Amazon. It's made with a wrist loop opening and not that opening A that I showed before. Now you might say that maybe it's just some kind of cognitive or cultural attractor, that we're just attracted to these diamond forms. But then we have a ton of these repetitive diamond forms in our data set, and none of them are as nearly as globally distributed as Jacob's ladder, the one I showed before. So I call these pseudo Jacob's ladders. They're similar enough, but still structurally somewhat different. But I think this kind of speaks against that recurrent pattern of people making Jacob's ladder by accident. So that brings us to the question of, might string figures actually have quite a deep ancestry? And the string figure pictured there now is, it's called the Plintios Prokos in Greek. I make that here, but it's actually verified to be at least around 2,000 years old. And the reason is you make it like this, and as you can see, the knot starts to kind of shrink. And this was actually used as a medical knot to bind a broken jaw. So you'd fix that underneath your jaw there and tie it above your head. So in ancient Greece, that was apparently one of the typical knots used in medicine. So we know for a fact that string figures were made, 2,000 years ago from this one literary piece of evidence. But also, when you really think about it, string has been around for quite a while, and in fact, string loops, the only technology you need to make a string figure, right, is a string loop. Those have been around for about 160,000 years because, well, most likely, because you find this very early evidence of humans apparently stringing beads. So the shell beads depicted here are perforated. They have this hole, naturally, I think they have this hole, but you can actually see that in these beads that they've been worn by string. So they have these kind of wear marks around the hole. So, if you have a string that goes through beads, then you of course have to tie it up somehow and make it a loop, otherwise the beads will fall off. So I think that's sort of, cautionary evidence with caveats that probably the string loop has existed for quite some time. And then in the more recent times, recent being only 73,000 years ago, you have this kind of evidence from, in this case, Blombos Cave at 73,000 years ago. you see this kind of typical diamond form that you also see in string. I'm not saying this is depicting a string figure, but at least you have early humans interested in the same kind of symbols that appear also very commonly in string figures. So basically you have the medium, you have the string loop, and you also have the symbolic behavior at least 70,000 years ago. So when you think about that, there's really nothing that suggests that people couldn't have been making or experimenting with string loops in these kind of string figure-like games at least 70,000 years ago, which is quite enough time for if you had an early string figure, for instance, for example, Jacob's ladder, then it might have spread through social learning throughout thousands of years even. Of course, it's very much speculative, but I think it's something to think seriously about. Which brings us to the final topic of this talk, which is, if string figures might have existed even for thousands of years, might have they acted as some kind of cognitive catalyst that people have been experimenting with string and maybe coming up with some mathematical ideas while doing so? Because, like I said earlier on, string figures are very algorithmic, and even to the extent that, for instance, this one pictured here is a very complex string figure from Nauru, and what they do here is they use this kind of generalizable algorithm that is called Eongatubabo. Might not pronounce it correctly. But regardless, it's something that you can use to generate string figure. You start with a different opening, then apply this algorithm, you'll come up with something, including this amazing string figure depicted here. But also, these complex string figures involve things like counting, they involve exploring with complex topology and geometry, and also just the general act of creating these kinds of cognitive puzzles that challenge you. So, in quite a few societies, string figures are associated with competitiveness, like cognitive competitiveness, even to the extent like in Nauru, for instance, they would hold these almost like Olympics in string figures. So you'd have this all-island competition of people trying to impress each other with more and more amazing structures. So it kind of developed into a kind of mind sport in a variety of societies. So all these traits considering, if people were experimenting with string figures in early human time, maybe they would have acted as some kind of catalyst for the early emergence of mathematical thinking as well. Quite often when you read these papers on string figures, people always assume that string figures emerged from something else, like nets, like fishing nets. And I think that's probably not the case, because a fishing net requires a lot of auxiliary technologies, whereas a string figure is just like I showed, it's just an open loop of string that you can experiment with. So maybe, it went the other way around. Maybe first we had string loops, maybe then some kind of string games that resulted in these net-like patterns, and that might have inspired someone to, experiment with string more. And that's what we're now trying to study in this, I suppose, new field of mathematics that we now call ethnotopology, studying the early knotting and string figure patterns of humankind. So what's next? Like I said, just Gauss coding all those string figures manually has been a real, I'm not going to say waste of time, but it's been a lot of time spent on doing something manually that could be automated. So I'm hoping that maybe there's a computational scientist somewhere who's interested in trying to develop forms or methods to automate this. But also it could be, string figures could easily be used to study other social learning experiments, like through transmission chain experiments, for instance. I'd also be interested in studying, what kind of string figures naive populations or so-called naive populations might come up with if kind of left alone to develop their own string figure culture. But yeah, that's basically it. I think most importantly, perhaps for myself, it's just the fact is that this is something that humans have done across space, across time, and it's rapidly disappearing. So even 100 years ago, ethnographers were saying, like, people are rather playing football these days. They're forgetting the art of string figures, and now this knowledge is almost all gone. So I think there's a sense of urgency in documenting that before cultural extinction kicks in. Yep. Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe I can start. And thanks for the talk. I mean, I think this is very, very cool. I saw the preprint and I'm not sure what it was. Anyway, that was very useful. I think we met maybe in the Cultural Evolution Society in Aarhus.
Yeah, we did.
But yeah, I think the first question, I have a question about complexity or measure of complexity and how it's that computed, because sometimes something that look quite complex to me, like an asymmetric figure, actually score less than other figures that were symmetric. So I wonder if you can give more details on that.
Yeah, so basically, if you have a symmetrical string figure, there's going to be a lot of repetition, a lot of redundancy, and in the Gauss code, which means that if you compress it, it'll fit into smaller file size. And the rationale between that is that you can make amazingly complex looking string figures with quite simple hand movements because it's all repetitive on both hands. Whereas a string figure that might look quite simple, but if it takes these kind of, like I showed before, the Arctic string figures, for instance, that represent animals like swans or the whale and the fox, those are immensely difficult to make. But they might look simpler for, I suppose, if you're not super familiar with the making of string figures.
So is basically a complexity is a measure of how many moves you need to do to produce the figure?
It kind of approximates that, I think, quite well. I tried it on various examples myself, and I think it makes intuitive sense, at least to myself, hopefully to other string figure experts as well.
So if I understand it correctly, it's like the raw file size and the compressed zip file size comparison is sort of the complexity. Is that what?
Yeah, that's what I did. But I'm sure there's many ways to measure the complexity of a numerical string. So
right. No, I think it's great. I think it's because that it takes into account all the repetitive sequences in a regardless of the length in a way. It's
yeah. And what I didn't mention there was that there's also a couple of methods available to describe formally the actual making of the string figure. So you can codify that into a formal language. And there was a mathematician called Tom Storer, who was a Navajo mathematician, and he learned to make Navajo string figures as a kid. And then he wrote this formal system that I've been now transcribing into computational or Unicode, doing my little alterations. But what you see here now shared on my screen is a symbol string that describes the making of a Jacob's ladder. But you can basically do that as well. I didn't do that to this data because doing this for 800 string figures would be quite intense. But yeah, working on this. That's, by the way, also based on Eric van den Driesch's work, who's written an amazing book on string figures as mathematics.
Yeah, it makes me think. I mean, I work with melodies, which is at the end is very similar because you represent them with lists of numbers that are the intervals and stuff. And of course, you could be thinking one thing is about how many steps or intervals you need, but then some steps are much harder than other steps. So singing a large interval would be harder. And I was wondering, I guess I have no idea of how this works, but I guess some of these steps you could assign weights to it in terms of like being really complex.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a step further than what I've done so far, but entirely possible, I think.
I have a couple of related questions about complexity. I think you briefly mentioned this, but I'm curious how close of a mapping there is between the complexity of the algorithms and the complexity of the structures themselves. And then I was also wondering if you've looked at how the complexity and diverse study of the string figures in different cultures, how closely they correlate with things like population size and political complexity and other demographic measures like that.
Yeah, I think regarding the first question, I think they're quite tightly correlated, like the difficulty of making a string figure and its appearance. But there are some exceptions where you can make like a simple nut-like figure look maybe a bit more complex than it is to make. But I think especially those animal form string figures are deceptively hard to make. So they can take something like, I don't know, 50 different asymmetrical steps to execute. Regarding the letter, we didn't run any analysis of that kind, and I know that's like a recurring thing and studying transmission of culture, that in larger populations you might expect to have more complex technologies, for instance. But I think in this case it doesn't really hold, because you have really small communities, for instance, in like hunter-gatherer peoples in Central Africa, or perhaps in Amazonia, or indeed much of the Pacific. You have small islands with relatively small populations, and you have like amazing complexity appearing in quite sparsely populated regions, which is, to me at least, quite interesting. And then contrarily, like in Europe, or well, especially in Europe, you really have a very low complexity of string figures. There's like a staple set of very simple figures, usually based on, for instance, the Cat's Cradle game you might know from your childhood. So yeah, we haven't tested it, but if I had to guess, I think there isn't much there, which is also like super interesting. And the strange thing is, like in many small scale societies, you see these recurring patterns of people making the exact, like the one I showed before, for instance, the swan, which is amazingly difficult to make. And you see this occurring, you know, across the Arctic and in different small scale societies. So it's quite fascinating from a cultural transmission perspective that something this complex is transmitted with extremely high fidelity, because if you make a simple mistake, it doesn't work. So it's like either you nail it or you know, it's definitely not the hoped for result.
I have a question about the map and the hierarchical structure. And you were mentioning certain patterns are very predominant in a specific region and so on.
Yeah.
But then, of course, these regions, some regions can be much closer than other in terms of like the sampling. So, for example, if you were to densely sample a specific region, you might also find the clusters to say that, oh, hang on, this particular pattern is predominant and spread in this particular region. But if you were to only take one sample because of your sampling, what you sample, then it would just look like a very niche string figure, right? So yeah, I was wondering how, like, obviously, if you speak about the universality, then it's fine, because, you know, you see it everywhere. But like, say something about this cultural niche, is there something that you would take into account how to resolve this?
Yeah, so what we did first was we selected only the societies represented in the standard cross-cultural sample, which is basically designed to have that specifically in mind. This is the entire sample here, but you could also run the same analysis on just the cultures from the standard cross-cultural sample. And I think that would kind of answer your question. I haven't done that, but
what would be also interesting to kind of see is like because you're measuring like cosine similarities between culture A and B, and
string figures and culture.
String figures. It'd be nice to see some kind of general correlation with this, with like the distance, physical distance, or something like that. So
there's a bit of a we did that, but I realized there's a bit of a confounder in that string figures can be like, if you think of similarity between 0 and 1, or distance between 0 and 1, it might be distant for two reasons. You might have like the same patterns, but it's just it has more crossings. It's just a more kind of advanced version of that same figure. So it didn't make much sense to me to think of it as a continuum as such. That's why I dichotomized it into identical and non-identical ones.
Right, I see.
It's a bit hard to explain, but it's all there in the paper in one of the supplementary notes.
Yeah, it is not.
But I think there might be a way to take that into account somehow.
Maybe you could, I was thinking out loud, but maybe completely different approach is to just train a CNN model on the images themselves, and then each string figure would
Yeah.
have a feature vector in this embedding space, and you could measure the
Yeah.
visual similarity in this way.
Yeah, I think this is something that we're interested in looking into later on, definitely.
Because
Oh.
sorry, go ahead, Mason.
I was just curious about the other, I think at the end you mentioned that you're thinking about applying these methods in other domains. And of course, I immediately thought of things like crochet. And then also, I think there might be a few examples of drawing that you could apply the knot theory methods to. I'm thinking about the columns that there's the Han and Beheim paper where people draw the designs in the sand with, I think, just one continuous movement, which means you end up with the crossovers and kind of very similar structures. And
yeah, definitely, like columns and sand drawings of various kinds, and also ornamental, like mathematical knots, like I showed, for instance, in that Thor's hammer. But that's also something you see like in Celtic knotting traditions and Japanese, Chinese ornaments as well. But also, like I said, we've been writing a more, because it's quite rare to find mathematical knots in real life. So confusingly, like our everyday knots aren't mathematical knots. So we've been developing this way of extending this method to also study practical everyday knots. And so now we have a preprint coming out very soon that actually does that for all the archaeological evidence and ethnographic evidence of knots that we could find across societies, which is interesting because those we can date to like 10,000 years ago, the earliest ones.
okay, cool.
But you could also do that, yeah, too, like crocheting, or like I said, you could gauss code a t-shirt if you wanted, but I think that has to be automated somehow.
Yeah. I guess the issue with like standard knot theory in this context is that like are all of these string figures unknots?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They always,
that's
because
really
you always
interesting.
start with an open loop of string,
Yeah.
and then it, by laws of topology, you have to also end up with that unless you cut it.
Yeah. That's a really interesting problem.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a mathematical problem called the unknotting problem. I think they're still debating if it's NP hard or not. I'm not sure.
Something else is that you mentioned at the end the idea of running this with cultural transmission experiments in the lab, where people, I guess, you make people do this and transmit these figures and so on. But I wonder how difficult would that be in terms of, so we do these experiments with singing, people hear a melody and then they sing it back. And of course you have production issues there because it's very hard to sing melodies, but still most people can imitate a melody. But how hard would it be to, if you give me like one of these kind of strings and I have to like imitate it just by singing, I don't think I would have a clue on how to do it. But do you think, is there any way, or do you think it could work? Or it would require some sort of training or?
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's something I kind of, because there the assumption would be that you have a naive individual who's not familiar with this. But of course, in these societies that we see in the real world, people are very much familiar with not only string figures, but string more generally. You know, people spent hours and hours of their everyday lives knotting or weaving and doing this kind of stuff. So I think some training might be, well, I suppose you could try with different ways, maybe have some group that has a bit of training. Maybe you could teach them the most common opening moves, for instance, like that opening A that I showed that appears, by the way, across cultures worldwide.
Because you think it's a skill, when I played that when I was young, I think it's a skill that you learn it, you just don't learn it from imitation. Like someone has to teach you how to do it. Or do you think there's a point where when you know a bit more, then you actually can do it by just seeing and then trying to imitate? Or is, I guess if the question is if it does require some kind of more active teaching to teacher to student step-by-step learning than just seeing the figure and trying to replicate it. Oops. I think my internet cut a little bit.
Form of social learning, I think.
I think we lost you for a moment.
Yes, I
Yeah,
was about to
sorry.
say that. Yeah.
My internet kind of cut for a bit.
No,
Yeah.
I think this is me again. But yeah, I was saying that I think string figures are the kind of thing that you have to learn with very kind of dedicated learning. So even when I learned this, I'm watching like a YouTube video or something on how to make a string figure, and it takes a lot of time to copy that. So it's not something you can just watch someone make and then, you know, replicate that unless you're really, really skilled, I think.
All right. Well, we just hit noon. So if you guys would like, we could stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Roope. That was a really fantastic talk. I'm really looking forward to digging into the preprint in more detail.
Right. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Cool stuff.